Hi everyone, this is Sam Black with Drafting Archetypes, and today I'm going to be discussing black-green in Aether Drift. As always, the notes are available to follow along at patreon.com/draftingarchetypes. We're like a day into 17 lands data, so it's too early for it to mean much. But the early data does suggest that green is the best color by a lot, but again, I would take that with a huge grain of salt. It also suggests that blue-green performs better than red-green performs better than green-black. Again, I wouldn't take that very seriously, but it does kind of match with my early experience in the format, which is that I found myself drafting green over and over because it just seemed like the good cards in the packs were green. So, as a result, most of my experience has been with green decks and green-black, so it seemed like that was the thing that I had enough experience with to talk about, given that I'm not really going to be relying on stats. I glanced at a tiny bit of the single card stats, but mostly ignored it. I mean, it was interesting that the 4/4 Reach Trample Common has like a 62 point something% win rate, which doesn't really seem realistic or sustainable, but does match my experience of feeling like I really like and want the card in a lot of my decks. So this is going to be more about my experience with and study of the cards in principle than a data-driven analysis. So I think there's a lot going on with green-black in terms of synergy. Your graveyard matters, types can matter, but also these things cannot matter. I'm going to talk about how there are kind of like a lot of different ways that you can approach it and different things that could be going on. But the graveyard is supposed to matter. There's a lot of support for graveyard. I feel a little bit weird saying the text of all the cards that interact, but let's do it. So, common and uncommon, you have the following cards that enable your graveyard, that like put extra cards in the graveyard in some way. There's Dredger's Insight, which is 1 and a green, enchantment, ETB, mill 4, return a permanent from among them to your hand, and then you gain a life whenever an artifact or creature leaves your graveyard. Broodheart Engine, black-green artifact, upkeep, surveil 2, 2 black-green, tap, sacrifice, return an artifact, a creature or vehicle from your graveyard to the battlefield. Molt Tender, green, 1/1, tap, mill a card, tap, remove a card in your graveyard from the game, exile a card in your graveyard, add a mana of any color. Carrion Cruiser, 2 and a black, 3/2, vehicle, crew 1, mill 2, then return a creature or artifact from your graveyard to your hand. Ooze Patrol, 3 and a green, 2/2, ETB, mill 2, and then it gets a +1/+1 counter for each creature and artifact in your graveyard. That card's been pretty impressive. It's very big. Pothole Mole, 2 and a green for a 2/3 ETB, mill 3, then return a land from your graveyard to your hand. Wreckage Wickerfolk, 1 and a black, 1/3 flying artifact creature, ETB, surveil 2. Grim Bauble, black artifact, target creature gets -2/-2 on ETB, 2 and a black, tap, sacrifice, surveil 2. And then also cycling creatures. So a lot of stuff that fills your graveyard. And then there are a bunch of cards that take advantage of your graveyard being full. Many of those cards, as well as Back on Track, which is 4 and a black to return a creature or vehicle from your graveyard to the battlefield and make a 1/1 pilot that cruises if it had 2 more power. Earth Rumbler, the vehicle that can exile a creature or artifact from your graveyard to crew itself. Rise from the Wreck, 2 and a green to return a creature, vehicle, mount, and creature with no abilities from your graveyard to your hand up to each of those. Wickerfolk Indomitable, the 4-mana 4/3 that you can cast from your graveyard by sacrificing an artifact and paying 2 life. Chitin Gravestalker, the 6-mana 5/4 that costs 1 less for each artifact and creature in your graveyard. Deathless Pilot, the 2/2 pilot that cruises if it has 2 more power for 1 and a black that you can return from your graveyard to your hand. For 3 and a black, there's Surveyors, which you can exile from your graveyard to draw a card if you have max speed. All of those take advantage of your graveyard being filled. So, a lot of cards dedicated to this thing. And that's just commons and uncommons. There's a pretty wide range of impact there. Like, some of those cards mill a lot more. Some of them care a lot more than others about how much graveyard you have. You know, many of these things are going to work fine in decks that aren't very graveyard focused, whereas others will more strongly encourage you to go deep on graveyard stuff. Very relevantly, there are also some rares that are pretty high impact that push you toward wanting to be green, black, and care about your graveyard. Primary ones being Atshik Emerald Radian, which makes insects for all of your creatures and artifacts in your graveyard, and Cursecloth Wrappings, which is 2 black for an artifact that you can tap to give a creature in your graveyard Embalm equal to its casting cost. And all zombies get +1/+1. Your zombies get +1/+1. I think both those cards are really powerful and really strong reasons to be like a green-black self-mill type deck. So you're often going to want to be paying attention to this graveyard stuff. I think Rise from the Wreck is actually worth planning for to some extent. This kind of card is often pretty awkward to use. I'm thinking Grim Captain's Call from Ixalan, which returns a vampire, merfolk, dinosaur, and pirate from your graveyard to your hand, and it's you're just what deck is going to have all that stuff? But here, you don't have to go all that far out of your way, and there's a lot of you don't need to have a ton of each of those in your deck because you're going to put a bunch of stuff in your graveyard. You're going to be putting stuff in your graveyard pretty quickly, pretty often, so you can use it against decks that aren't killing your things. You don't need all that much support. I think it's pretty realistic. And I think the fact that it exists and is reasonable to play means that you should put some amount of thought to planning for it if you're a dedicated graveyard deck. What that means mostly is prioritizing Venomsac Lagak, the 1 and a green 2/1 Death Touch that you can saddle to give +0/+3 when it attacks. This is the only good common mount in black-green, in my opinion. The other option is the 5-mana 4/4 Vigilance that you can saddle to give +2/+2, which I just don't think is where I want to be. And Venomsac Lagak is certainly much better for enabling Rise from the Wreck because it's a cheap creature that trades off pretty easily. So, and it also having Death Touch means that it's going to be pretty strong in the late game also. So it just plays really well with Rise to the Wreck in kind of the early game and late game. It's a cheap thing that trades off, which means that the impact of getting a bunch of stuff back is going to be higher. Really good synergy there. And then Gibbrick Omnivore, the 1 and a green common 3/2 with no abilities. So these are 2 creatures that are green 2-drops that are very good at trading off, that you can kind of get back for free when you're doing your other Rise of the Wreck stuff, returning creatures and vehicles, if you have them. Also, prioritizing Gibbrick Omnivore lets you take advantage of the 2/4 reach that searches for a vanilla creature, which I think is really good. Fang Druid Summoner. And yeah, I think basically both of these cards, absent synergy, I think would kind of be exactly not good enough that you would really want them in your green-black deck. But if you're combining them with Fang Druid Summoner or Rise from the Wreck, they go from just undesirable to quite desirable very quickly. And then the uncommon vanilla creatures are also good with Rise from the Wreck and Fang Druid Summoner. But it's more just like, if you don't have one of those yet, pick up a Gibberic Omnivore to kind of have that base covered. As with most formats, it's very important to have defense against flyers. You're kind of a slower deck. Most of your creatures don't fly. It's very easy for this kind of deck to try to stabilize and just lose to flying creatures. So there are good tools to combat that. You just need to watch for them and prioritize them. Wreckage Wickerfolk, the 1 and a black, 1/3 ETB Surveil 2 is just fantastic in this deck. Sometimes you care about being an artifact. You definitely care about being a 1/3 flyer, both to block and to enable start your engine stuff. The Surveil to fill your graveyard is great. Just a fantastic card here. Hazard of the Dunes, the 3 and a green, 4/4 reach trample with exhaust 6 green to put 3+1/+1 counters on it. I already mentioned that this card has pretty unbelievable early stats, but plays really well in this deck on defense and also in some other ways that I'm going to get into more detail on later. Migrating Ketradon, 4 GG, cycling 2, 6/6 reach, ETB gain 4. This card's fantastic in this archetype. You have ways to recur it from your graveyard. You can cycle it early to get a creature in your graveyard, get it back later. Really good to, just cast on turn 6 or whatever to stabilize, gain life. Very important for beating any sort of aggro deck. I'm really happy to play 4 of these or something. Broken Wings, 2 and a green, destroy target artifact, enchantment, or creature with flying. I think plays pretty well in this set. I talked about that on the last episode. Really good way to have additional flying defense in green-black. Fang Druid Summoner, 2/4 reach, search for a vanilla creature. Already talked about that. It's great here. 2/4 reach is totally reasonable stats. I mean, this is a full giant spider that just gets a card for free on top of it. And giant spider is, obviously not good, but it's a decent way to defend against flyers. And then Sheffet Archfiend, the 7 mana 5/5 ETB, all creatures get -2/-2, cycling 2. It's not what I would consider early flying defense for the most part, but it gets the job done, and you can cycle it and get it back with Broodheart Engine or back on track. So it can certainly be a reasonable part of your flying defense plan. Same situation with Thundering Broodwagon, the black-green vehicle that crews into a 6/5 reach and destroys creature or permanent, non-land permanent with mana value 4 or less when it enters. This plays really well with Broodheart Engine because you can get it back for 4 mana. Either that could be the first time you play it or after you play it and it dies, which means that if you have Broodheart Engine in play and you have this, your opponent if you have Broodheart Engine and you play Thundering Broodwagon, your opponent wants to attack, you have a reach blocker. If they want to kill your blocker, you get to get it back and kill another one of their things. It's a really tough spot for them. The other card I want to point out is Silken Strength. This is the 1 and a green flash aura that gives +1/+2 reach and untaps on ETB. I haven't played with that, but there's a lot going on with it, right? It could easily be better than it looks. Permanent +1/+2 in reach is just very good for defending against flyers. And then you also theoretically are, getting to kill a creature, win a combat when it enters. It's a really strong trick. On that note, combat tricks are in a really interesting place here. Silken Strength among them, but certainly not exclusive. It's weird because the combat tricks play very poorly with the graveyard stuff. The graveyard stuff cares a lot about your card types. You want to be milling creatures, you want to be milling artifacts, you have a bunch of stuff that counts how many creatures and artifacts are in your graveyard. If your deck is full of instants, anytime you mill an instant, you're going to be sad that you're not boosting the synergy of your stuff that counts the other types in your graveyard. So, that's awkward. However, the tricks are both just remarkably good cards, and more importantly, they're the exact right cards to pair with the creatures that are available in green and black, kind of specifically the vanilla creatures, but certainly not exclusively. So you have Defend the Rider, which is green instant, target creature gets hexproof and indestructible, or instead you can make a 1/1 pilot. That is the kind of trick that is just very good when you have expensive creatures. Expensive creatures don't need extra power and toughness, they just need to stay alive. And this is a deck that has kind of the biggest creatures, so Defend the Rider to protect them is very good. Bestow Greatness, 2 and a green. Target creature gets +4/+4 and trample. There are a lot of high power creatures that lack trample in this archetype. You have Migrating Ketrodon, the 6/6 reach does not have trample. You also have the vanilla creatures, the 5 mana 9/7 and the 3 mana 7/2. Giving either of those trample is going to present a huge amount of damage. There's also Maximum Overdrive, which is 1 and a black, target creature gets a +1/+1 counter, as well as Lifelink and Death Touch. Giving lifelink to these huge creatures is also really, really strong. But, notably, if you combine Bestow Greatness and Maximum Overdrive, you can give both Death Touch and Trample, as well as lifelink and 4 extra power. You can Bestow Greatness something. If your opponent tries to kill it in response, you can Maximum Overdrive to stop it from dying. Otherwise, it gets +4/+4, will die to fewer things. You Maximum Overdrive. Now it has Death Touch and Trample. It was probably like a 6 power creature to begin with. They just take a ton of trample damage and die. It doesn't have lifelink there. Bad. Sorry. But it'll still probably win the game. Also, Maximum Overdrive plays really well with Hazard of the Dunes, which naturally has trample, as a way to get Trample Death Touch. Additionally, there's Run Over, which is 1 and a green. Target creature control deals damage equal to its power to target creature, and it costs 1 less if it targets a mount or vehicle. Plays notably well with Venom Sack Lagak. So these tricks play really well with the creatures here and really well with each other. The problem is just that they don't work with the graveyard thing. So I think that you kind of need to decide if you're kind of this more aggressive big creatures and the kinds of tricks that are good with big creatures deck, or if you're the more grindy defensive graveyard based recursion card advantage type deck. I think the reach creature thing is way more important if you're the graveyard type deck. And though it's, somewhat important either way, it's just more important if you're trying to play a longer, grindier game. And the vanilla creatures and high power creatures are more important in this green-black numbers and combat tricks type deck that I think is a different deck that is also very much present. Due to the black commons, black-green can also be surprisingly interested in artifacts. Pactol Terror is really, really good. That's the 3 and a black, 3/4. When an artifact enters, drain your opponent for 1. That plays really well with Grimbauble and the Wreckage Wickerfolk. And just a bunch of the other stuff you're playing, Broodheart, and both of the black-green uncommons are artifacts. And as mentioned, the stuff that in other sets cares about the number of creatures in your graveyard, in this set, those cards were printed to care about creatures and artifacts, which means that you are encouraged to play Grimbaubles and Scrap Compactor, the 1 mana artifact that can tap and pay 3 to deal 3 damage to a creature, or tap and pay 6 and sacrifice in both cases. Tap, pay 6, sacrifice, destroy target creature or vehicle. If those are your removal spells, they're contributing to your Chitin Gravestalker and Ooze Patrol, and also triggering your Pactol Terror, and also while they're in play, they're counting toward your affinity for artifacts, which there's a little bit of in black at higher rarity. And, you can splash some of the blue stuff that cares about artifacts, most notably the Haunting, 3 blue-black, make 2 Thopters, drain your opponent for life equal to the number of artifacts you control. So pay attention to artifact count, artifact synergies, which is a little bit weird for a green deck, but, here we are. So basically, the result of all this is there's there's tension if you try to take advantage of every possible synergy that exists in the color combination. So you want to be really mindful about which of the things that you can be doing here you're actually doing, and not play the higher synergy, the stuff that requires more synergy that you're not as deeply supporting as you might be. And then to really be supporting the synergies and game plan that you are going for from among what's possible here. I guess I should also comment on splashing. I think almost every time I've drafted green-black, I have drafted it with a splash. I've had, 2 or 3 fixing lands and 3 cards of another color that all seemed pretty good. And every time I've gone to deck building and I've had a few too many cards and I've looked at it and I've been this is a really consistent, coherent deck that has a few too many cards, and there's nothing I really want to cut. All of the cards play well here and are supporting the plan, including the cards I'd be splashing. But I could just cut the ones I'm splashing and cut the splash and not need to agonize over what to cut instead. And the splash cards are generally really powerful cards. They're probably stronger than many of the other cards in my deck, but they're probably not quite worth messing up my mana for. And so I end up playing it as straight green-black. I'm sure that won't happen every time. I'm sure there will be times when it's worth splashing. But it's notable that there are a lot of cards that you want to play that have a lot of pips. Spin Out, the 1 black, destroy target creature or vehicle instant, and vanilla creature uncommons. You have 1 BB for a 7/2, for a 7/2, and 3 GGG for a 7/9. Neither of those really want you to be splashing. So even though you can end up with some fixing pretty easily from Molt Tenders and Pothole Moles, and it's not bad to play the bike, the 3 mana 4/2 vehicle ETB, gain 2 life, taps for mana of any color. So you can have some fixing, but even when I do, I often feel I just want the fixing to make my green and black mana better more than I want it to splash other cards. Again, I'm sure you'll splash sometimes. This is the kind of deck that should want to splash. Again, you have natural, synergistic fixing, and you're playing a long game, seeing a lot of cards. You have a bunch of surveil. No reason that you should have any trouble with this. But at the same time, the mana in the formats felt tricky, and I've felt like I've been punished for splashing more often than not. So that's where I'm at on splashing. Now, I'm going to turn it over to questions from chat. So let's discuss green-black. While I'm waiting for comments and questions, again, of course, check out patreon.com/draftingarchetypes to get involved in the Patreon, support the podcast, make me happy, maybe get some benefits, discounts, stuff like that. How many cards of each type are you aiming for with Rise from the Wreck? Not a ton. I mean, I don't expect to have more than 2 mounts, 2 vehicles, 2 typeless creatures. If I have 3 of 2 of them and 1 of the other, that would probably be fine. How good it is going to depend as much on how many of the types you have as how good you are at filling your graveyard, how much that makes sense in your plan. If you're the longer, grindier deck with more reach creatures, it's going to be a lot better than if you're the more aggressive deck with a bunch of combat tricks. Even though the combat tricks deck might like the Venom Sack Lagak and the vanilla creatures, you're just going to be playing shorter games with that deck, and your like non-creature cards are like recursion spells rather than like your non-creature cards, like you're playing combat tricks, so you have a lower density of creatures and vehicles and stuff like that. There's also tension between playing vehicles and playing combat tricks, because both vehicles and combat tricks need you to have creatures in play, which I think is part of why the combat tricks in this set are so pushed. So, because it's like, there's a real opportunity cost to playing with the combat tricks because the vehicles are also good. So, to make it so you would ever want to put a combat trick in your deck, they have to be kind of better than they usually are, which is why they're so good here. And, that was done. And so they're appealing, but you need to like think about how many cards you have that need creatures and, how often you have those creatures. What do you think about the 2 1-mana uncommon black cards with cycling at uncommon in this space? I think that the discard spell, black, look at your opponent's hand, make them discard, exile creature or artifact that cycles for 3 is a really good card. I've seen multiple games kind of like end on turn 1 when someone takes their opponent's like thing that was like their access to mana, like taking a Molt Tender or a like bike or whatever. It's also just like gives you a bunch of information, disrupts your opponent's curve, and it's a discard spell with cycling. So if you draw it late after your opponent's empty-handed, you can cycle it. And then the Locust Swarm or whatever, the target creature gets -1/-1, cycling black. Is another strong card because it cycles for only a single mana, and like in the first couple of turns if your opponent is playing a 1 toughness creature you want to kill most of the time. So they're both strong cards. The problem is just they have bad types. So whether you want to play or prioritize them kind of just depends on how much your deck cares about its like creature artifact density. The more like self-mill you have, the worse it is to have things that you're milling that don't have the types that you want. And then obviously the more, Chitin Gravestalkers you have and Ooze Patrols you have, like those are going to be the highest impact in terms of like discouraging playing these like off-type cards. So that kind of leaves, if you don't care about types, then they're good. However, when you don't care about types because you're like the combat trick aggro deck that can't really afford to care about types, then it's like, well, are these the like are these the non-creature spells you want? Like, would you rather have this than another combat trick? Because like you need your creature density to be able to play the combat tricks, and like the reason you're playing that creature density with the combat tricks is because you like have this aggressive game plan that kind of needs the combat tricks to like pay you for it. So I think both cards are strong, but they're both kind of difficult to fit in this particular archetype. I'm curious how you prioritize/pick Broodheart Engine. It's hard to pick it over relevant creatures early, I feel like. I guess I don't know what you consider a relevant creature. I think that the card is like pretty powerful, pretty high synergy. I've had good experiences with it returning any of the 3 good cycling creatures, being the Sheffet Demon Guy, the Ketradon, and the green-black vehicle. With all of those, you can just go like turn 2 engine or cycle, turn 3 engine or cycle, turn 4 reanimate, or you can go like turn 4 engine go, end your turn cycle, turn 5 reanimate, which I think is kind of the better line for like the fast reanimate there. But then on top of that, it does the like slow graveyard filling thing when you care about that. I think it's a strong card. I take it over like what I'd consider like a filler creature, like most common creatures. If I'm like green-black, I see this as a good green-black card, and I see most common creatures, even when they have synergy, as replaceable, because so many of the common creatures do have synergy here. So, I guess what this is to say, I'm willing to prioritize the card. But you can also just like try to table it, especially like, pack 1, send it around, see if like green-black's open or not. It's good, but it's not going to like break you if it doesn't come back. And if you learn and you end up pivoting out of green-black, that's good too. When you surveil in a deck like this, how do you balance wanting to draw action versus wanting to put artifacts and creatures in your graveyard? When it's like basically early, when in doubt, graveyard. And then when you start running out of stuff to do in your hand, then you kind of just like leave all of the like good draws on top and draw them and cast them, is roughly how I would say I've been doing it. But, mostly if it's not something that you want to draw and cast right now, I kind of like bin it and hope to like make my next draw step good by surveilling like a land in the graveyard next, or like a creature that is on curve on top next. So like if I have 4 mana and there's a 2 mana creature, be like, this is, I'm hoping for something better. And if it's like turn 3 and it's a Ketradon, be like, yeah, I'll just put this in the graveyard and I can get it back with the engine and draw something on curve now. So I guess to some extent I just become very short-sighted is how I kind of balance it. Which is to say, like, the reason to become short-sighted is like you're gaining value by putting a thing in the graveyard. So if the thing that you want is a thing that's like an investment in the future where you're gaining value by drawing it, I kind of see that as a wash. Whereas like I don't want to go down on immediate value by drawing a worse card that I'm going to cast right now because I already have a long game source of advantage. So like value now is like more important than value later because I'm going to get my value later. So the like become short-sighted thing, I think like makes a lot of sense contextually, strategically. If you're in straight black-green near the end of a draft, would you pick the black-green gain land or the common pick one cycling land? Gain land. Gain land by a lot, actually. I think that because the green-black decks have double pip in both green and black, tap a single land that gives you both colors is meaningfully better than choosing a color to tap for. And the gain of life is about as good as like the cycling option, if not better. I don't think you cycle very much, and life gain matters. I worry that the perception of black-green being the best is going to ruin the chances of engine tabling. Again, if that's true and it happens, that might just be a table where I don't want to be in green-black. I also don't know that there is a perception of black-green being the best right now. I mean, like I said, green is the best, but black-green is the third best performing archetype in the early data. So, yeah, I'm just not sure to what extent that is the perception, what extent you need to draft around that. And I guess I'm also not totally sure to what extent I want to be, fighting with people if that's what's going on. Also, if you send it around and it doesn't table and you're like committed to green black and it seems open enough, you can just be like, okay, clearly someone else is the grindy green black deck, so I'm going to go for the like aggro tricks green black deck. What kind of cards do you not want to see when you're playing the deck? What kinds of cards play well against the graveyard version / combat tricks version? I mean, very aggressive flyers, generally really good starts and bombs. The 4-mana 3/4 ETB and attack exile thing in a graveyard gain a life can randomly be pretty disruptive to your graveyard stuff. And I guess sometimes like blue-white can realistically go over the top of you with their like big vehicle card advantage chains and big flyers and like card removal that exiles sometimes. Is the 3/4 graveyard hate creature good? I don't think so. I don't especially like putting it in my deck. I think it's not embarrassing and good against green-black. Sometimes. Like, sometimes it just gets outclassed and can't attack, but like the graveyard hate aspect can matter quite a bit. Are the heavy mana requirements a green-black thing, or does that apply to this format in general? I have the most experience with green-black, and I've thought about it most in the context of green-black. I think it's most true of green-black, given like spin out and the uncommon vanilla creatures, whereas like the uncommon vanilla creatures in the other colors are single pip, and most of the removal spells in the other colors are single pip. So I'm not totally sure to what extent I think it applies to the rest of the format, but I definitely do think it applies to green-black. Interesting, you say you want to be able to crew the vehicle the turn they come down. Is blocking with vehicles something I want to be doing in general? So I don't know if you have a lot of experience playing with creatures that enter the battlefield tapped, but it's a really big drawback. Like, taking a turn where you're playing to the board and can't block with the thing that you deployed to the board is just always something that like matters and results in taking a bunch of extra damage. It's not that I'm like looking for vehicles as my primary way to defend myself. It's more that just like I want all of my creatures to block the turn that I play them. It's really like you take a lot of damage when you play a creature that can't block the turn that you play it, and the vehicles count. Does the fact that green gets two good reach creatures at common slightly reduce how much you want to prioritize removal for green decks in general? This is weird because it exists in like a context where I want to prioritize removal for other reasons than I get to because of the creatures, is more like how I think about it. Like I want to decrease how much I'm prioritizing removal because I want to care about my creature density. And I'm glad that I have good creatures that can block that let me get away with doing that. I think that's my answer to the question, even though I feel like I'm answering a very slightly different question. Okay, I think that's going to wrap us up for this week. Thanks everyone for listening. Excited to dive further into Aether Drift. Next week, we'll probably be able to take some data into account and have some more experience with some other archetypes. Too early for me to know for sure if I'm going to feel comfortable with a poll or just deciding what I want to talk about. It might be a situation where I do a poll with only like a couple of different options. We'll see. Have a good week, and I will be back next week as usual. Bye for now.
Prepare for light speed.